The transport shuttle trembled slightly as it pierced through the upper atmosphere of an uncharted planet, leaving a thin trail of ionized gas behind. Daniel Carter stared out of the narrow viewport, watching the barren landscape grow larger with each passing second. This planet had no name, only a designation, X-47b, a rock floating on the edge of a dying star system. The sky was a muted shade of gray, the kind that suggested the air was thin but technically breathable. The planetary surface stretched endlessly in all directions, a mix of cracked earth, jagged cliffs, and lifeless dust. It was a graveyard of a world, long abandoned by time itself. Daniel adjusted the straps of his harness as the shuttle's descent stabilized. He could already hear the hushed murmurs of the other students, mostly aliens from different corners of the galaxy, each representing their respective civilizations. They were all here for the same reason, the final survival exam of the Galactic Academy. The task was simple in theory: survive for 1 week with limited supplies and document environmental conditions. However, X-47b was one of the most inhospitable places selected for this challenge, a world with no recorded ecosystem, no life, and no known resources beyond rocks and decaying minerals. The shuttle landed with a low, mechanical hum, its landing struts sinking slightly into the brittle ground. As the ramp extended, the students filed out, each one scanning their surroundings with portable scanners, their various appendages, or whatever sensory organs their species relied on. Daniel stepped onto the surface, his boots crunching against the dry terrain. A gust of wind swept across the landing site, carrying fine grains of dust that clung to his uniform. The air was thin, but his body quickly adapted, lungs working slightly harder to compensate for the lower oxygen levels. Professor Jules Vache, an elder scholar from the Krell Dominion, stood at the center of the group, his tall, insectoid frame silhouetted against the pale horizon. His multiple eyes scanned the students before he raised his 2 primary arms, signaling for silence. "You have 1 week," he announced in his deep, clicking voice. "Use your intellect, your instincts, and your discipline. Your survival depends on your ability to adapt, but more importantly, on your ability to understand the environment. There is nothing here to sustain you. You will find no plants, no water, no shelter. This is a true wasteland. Yet even here, lessons can be learned. Document your findings. The test begins now." With that, the professor turned and walked toward a small observation station, a temporary outpost where he and a team of overseers would monitor the students' progress. He had no intention of intervening unless absolutely necessary. The students wasted no time. Several of the reptilian Ura quickly began digging into the ground, attempting to carve out protective burrows against the temperature shifts that would come at night. The amphibious Lanari assembled reflective shields to preserve moisture around their bodies, while the Avexi, a race of avian scholars, started constructing high-altitude perches to keep watch over the terrain. Everyone had their methods, developed through centuries of survival on their respective homeworlds. Daniel, however, did not immediately follow suit. Instead of rushing to find shelter, he crouched down and ran his fingers across the dirt. He let the grains slip between his fingers, noting their texture and density. It was dry, almost completely devoid of organic matter. He grabbed a portable scanner from his belt and ran a basic analysis. The results confirmed what the professor had said. No water, no signs of life, only remnants of minerals that had long since lost their usefulness. Most students ignored him. A few cast amused glances in his direction, whispering among themselves. Daniel was the only human here, and humans had a peculiar reputation in the Galactic Academy. They were adaptable, yes, but they were also seen as impulsive, reckless, too reliant on intuition rather than precise calculations. He could feel their skepticism, but he didn't care. He wasn't here just to survive, he wanted to know why this planet was dead. Standing up, he glanced toward a jagged ridge in the distance. It looked like an old riverbed, long since dried up and cracked open by time. If there had been water once, even eons ago, then perhaps something remained, something hidden beneath the surface. He adjusted his pack and started walking toward it, leaving the others behind. The journey took longer than expected. The gravity of X-47b was slightly heavier than Earth's, making each step feel sluggish, as though the planet itself was resisting movement. The ridge loomed ahead, its walls steep and eroded. He climbed carefully, gripping onto stable rocks to avoid loose debris. When he finally reached the top, he saw what he had hoped for: layered sediment, the kind that only formed when water had once been present. He pulled out a small digging tool and began scraping away at the layers. The deeper he went, the darker and denser the soil became. His heart pounded slightly as he removed another layer and saw something unexpected. Tiny, barely visible specks of greenish-black material. He grabbed a sample and placed it under a magnifier. At first glance, it looked like dust, but under closer examination he saw tiny, dormant bacterial structures. His breath caught in his throat. This planet wasn't completely dead. It was sleeping. Excitement surged through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to be sure. He pulled out a portable environmental stimulator, a small device used for controlled experiments in hostile environments. If these bacteria were still viable, even after all these centuries, then a small push might reactivate them. He placed a few grains of soil into the device and carefully adjusted the settings: mild heat, controlled humidity, and a trace amount of oxygen. Then he waited. Minutes passed. Then movement. The bacteria twitched, then expanded, absorbing the moisture. Slowly, they began multiplying, feeding on the minute resources introduced into their environment. Daniel sat back, his mind racing. This wasn't just a discovery, this was proof that life, no matter how small, could persist even in the most extreme conditions. If these microbes were still functional, then in the right environment, they could potentially rebuild an ecosystem from nothing. The implications were staggering. He grabbed his communicator, about to contact the professor, but then hesitated. No, not yet. He needed more data. If he was right, this could be the most important thing he had ever discovered. But if he was wrong, it was just a false hope. One thing was certain. This exam was no longer just about survival. It was about resurrection, and he intended to bring this world back to life. Daniel crouched beside the environmental stimulator, watching the microscopic bacteria expand and multiply under controlled conditions. The faint greenish tint of their cellular structures confirmed what he had suspected. These organisms weren't just remnants of a long-dead world. They were alive, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. He adjusted the humidity levels slightly, ensuring they had just enough moisture to continue their metabolic process without overwhelming them. A gust of dry wind swept across the ridge, sending fine dust spiraling into the air. He squinted against the debris and checked the local atmospheric readings. The oxygen levels remained minimal, but with enough microbial activity, even that could change. The bacteria were primitive, likely the earliest form of extremophiles, but they had potential. If they had survived in dormancy for centuries, perhaps they could thrive again with the right support. He glanced toward the camp below, where the other students had settled into their survival strategies. Most were constructing shelters or rationing their supplies, unaware that something far more significant was happening just beyond their line of sight. He considered calling out to one of them, but he knew how the others viewed him. Curious, perhaps intelligent, but ultimately unpredictable. If he wanted to prove the importance of this discovery, he had to let the results speak for themselves. Carefully, he scooped a larger sample of the bacterial-laden soil into a containment vial and sealed it. The sample needed a stable environment, free from contamination, if he was going to analyze it further. He secured the vial in his pack and descended the ridge, moving carefully along the uneven terrain. His mind raced with possibilities as he made his way back toward the center of the testing zone. As he reached the outskirts of the encampment, he saw the Avexi students perched atop makeshift observation towers, their elongated limbs tucked beneath their feathered bodies as they surveyed the landscape. The Urok had burrowed deep into the ground, their hardened scales protecting them from the elements, while the Linari clustered in shaded areas, their gelatinous skin adapting to the fluctuating temperatures. Daniel kept his distance, heading toward the supply station where his equipment was stored. He needed more controlled testing before drawing any conclusions. If the bacteria could be revived on a larger scale, they might trigger an environmental shift. Even a minor increase in oxygen production could set off a chain reaction, altering the planet's atmospheric composition over time. Inside his designated workspace, he retrieved a set of nutrient compounds designed for emergency agricultural use. These were meant to sustain plant life in low-pore environments, but if modified correctly, they could provide the necessary boost for bacterial growth. He carefully extracted a small amount of the compound and mixed it with a fresh soil sample, then placed it under the microscope. The response was immediate. The bacteria absorbed the nutrients at an accelerated rate, their cellular structures expanding and dividing faster than before. He adjusted the magnification, observing the delicate filaments forming between the clusters. This wasn't just survival, this was regeneration. Excitement surged through him, but he forced himself to remain methodical. He recorded the data, noting the environmental thresholds required for growth. The process was fragile, easily disrupted by fluctuations in temperature or pressure. If he wanted to scale this experiment, he needed a more stable testing ground. The thought of informing Professor Jules Vache crossed his mind, but he hesitated. The professor was a strict academic, valuing structured research over speculative theories. If Daniel presented his findings too soon, the professor might dismiss them as irrelevant to the survival challenge. He needed undeniable proof, evidence that couldn't be ignored. Stepping away from the microscope, he examined the surrounding landscape. The ridge had provided shelter from the wind, but a more controlled area would be ideal for long-term observation. His gaze settled on a shallow crater not far from the encampment. The terrain there was more compact, with layers of sediment that could retain moisture longer than the exposed ground. It would be the perfect test site. He gathered his equipment and set out toward the crater, moving quickly to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. The sun, a pale and distant sphere, cast elongated shadows across the land as he reached the edge of the depression. The ground here was more stable, a sign that erosion had preserved certain geological features better than in other areas. He set up a small containment zone, marking the perimeter with sensor beacons to monitor temperature and atmospheric fluctuations. Then, he carefully spread a layer of nutrient-enriched soil across the designated area and introduced a controlled water supply. The bacteria, once dormant, began to spread, forming intricate patterns beneath the surface. Over the next few hours, he watched as the microbial colonies expanded, feeding on the minerals embedded in the ground. The air around him felt subtly different, not enough to register on a scanner, but enough for him to sense the slightest change. The bacteria were doing more than just existing. They were transforming their environment. He stepped back, taking in the significance of what he had just initiated. If this process continued, even on a microscopic scale, it could signal the beginning of something much larger. The barren wasteland around him was no longer just a survival test site. It was a canvas, waiting for life to return. For the first time since arriving on X-47b, he felt an overwhelming certainty. This planet wasn't dead. It had simply been waiting. Daniel crouched at the edge of the crater, his gaze fixed on the soil where the bacteria had begun their silent work. Hours had passed since he had introduced them to the nutrient-enriched environment, and now, faint, almost imperceptible changes rippled across the ground. He adjusted his scanner, fine-tuning its sensitivity. The atmospheric readings had shifted, just slightly, but undeniably. Oxygen levels had increased by a fraction of a percent, too little for most to notice. But for him, it was confirmation. He exhaled slowly, his breath forming a thin mist in the dry air. He wasn't imagining it. The bacteria were actively producing oxygen, feeding on the minerals and accelerating processes that should have taken centuries. His fingers twitched with the need to take notes, to record everything before the moment passed, but his mind urged patience. He needed to observe, to understand before drawing conclusions. A distant sound broke his concentration. He turned his head slightly, ears tuning in to the faint echo of movement. Someone was approaching. Daniel stood, brushing the dust from his hands as a figure crested the ridge. The elongated silhouette, the sharp, deliberate steps. It was an Avexi student, Relin. The Avexi were known for their observational prowess, their keen eyesight, capable of detecting minute environmental shifts. If Relin had come this way, it wasn't by coincidence. The Avexi descended toward him with the grace of a being accustomed to high-altitude perches. His large, feathered wings folded neatly behind his back as he landed a few paces away, his golden eyes narrowing. "You've been here for hours," Relin said, his voice low, almost cautious. "What are you doing?" Daniel considered his response. He had no intention of hiding his findings, but he also wasn't ready to explain them in full detail. He gestured toward the ground. "Testing something," he said simply. Relin tilted his head, his gaze flicking to the sensors Daniel had placed around the area. He was intelligent, methodical, and clearly aware that this was no ordinary survival exercise. He took a step closer, his taloned fingers tracing the outline of a scanner. "You're monitoring atmospheric changes," Relin observed. "That isn't part of the exam." Daniel hesitated. He could dismiss the comment, feign ignorance, or deflect, but he saw no point. Instead, he nodded. "Something's happening here," he admitted. "Something worth documenting." Relin studied him for a long moment before crouching beside the disturbed soil. His avian features remained impassive, but Daniel recognized the quiet curiosity in his expression. Without a word, Relin pulled a scanning device from his belt and activated it. The interface flickered as it processed the environment. Seconds later, the Avexi's eyes widened, just slightly, but enough for Daniel to notice. "You altered the oxygen levels," Relin murmured, more to himself than to Daniel. "This shouldn't be possible." Daniel crossed his arms. "It is." Relin's gaze flicked toward him, sharp and questioning. "How?" Daniel exhaled, shifting his stance. "I found something beneath the surface. Microbial life. It was dormant, but it wasn't dead. With the right conditions, it started functioning again. This isn't just a barren world, Relin. It's a world that can recover." Relin didn't respond immediately. He studied the readings on his device, cross-referencing them with his own environmental knowledge. Eventually, he straightened. "If what you're saying is true, then this is significant," Relin admitted. "Have you told Professor Jules Vache?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. I need more data." Relin's feathers ruffled slightly, a sign of contemplation. "Then let's get more." Daniel hadn't expected that response. He had assumed Relin would be skeptical, dismissive even, but the Avexi seemed genuinely intrigued. "You want to help?" Daniel asked. Relin's wings shifted as he folded his arms. "I want to understand. If this planet has potential, the implications are vast." Daniel nodded. He could use another pair of hands, especially someone with Relin's observational skills. Together they expanded the test area, placing additional sensors at varying distances to track how far the bacterial influence extended. Relin moved with precision, his mind clearly focused on efficiency. Daniel appreciated that. Hours passed. The temperature dropped as the planet's weak sun began to sink below the horizon. Daniel activated his thermal gear, but Relin, adapted to high-altitude climates, seemed unbothered by the chill. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the sensors emitted a rapid alert, its interface flashing with new data. Daniel rushed to check the readings, his pulse quickening. The oxygen levels had increased again, but this time not just in the immediate area. The shift had expanded beyond their test site, affecting the surrounding atmosphere. Relin examined the data beside him. "This is accelerating," he muttered. Daniel nodded. "Faster than I anticipated." The bacteria were spreading beyond the controlled environment, interacting with the untouched soil. Something in the planet's composition was acting as a catalyst, amplifying the effect. A gust of wind swept through the crater, carrying an unfamiliar scent. Faint, almost unnoticeable, but distinctly different from the dry, stagnant air of before. It smelled like rain. Daniel and Relin exchanged a look. This wasn't just a slow, scientific process anymore. This was a chain reaction, and it had already begun. Daniel knelt beside the scanner, watching the data scroll across the display. The oxygen levels had continued to rise, the changes no longer contained within the crater. The bacteria had spread further than anticipated, interacting with the soil in ways he had not yet accounted for. He glanced at Relin, who was analyzing the wind currents, his golden eyes narrowing as he adjusted his scanning device. The Avexi was silent, his expression unreadable, but Daniel could sense the weight of realization settling over him. The wind carried the faint scent of moisture, an impossible phenomenon on a world where water had not existed for centuries. Daniel turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the dying light of the sun painted the sky in muted shades of violet and gray. The temperature was dropping rapidly, but instead of the dry, suffocating cold he had expected, the air felt heavier, more alive. Relin clicked his beak softly, a sign of contemplation. This level of atmospheric change should not be occurring at this rate, he murmured. The bacteria are interacting with something beyond just the mineral content of the soil. Daniel nodded. He had already considered that possibility, but without deeper analysis, he could only guess at what the true catalyst was. He activated his geoscanner, sweeping it across the terrain. The readings fluctuated wildly, showing anomalies beneath the surface. He frowned. "There's something buried here," he said. Relin tilted his head. "Explain." Daniel expanded the scanner's range, mapping the underground composition. A pattern emerged. Deep below the surface, vast pockets of crystallized minerals formed an intricate lattice, almost like a natural storage system. He exhaled slowly as realization dawned on him. This planet wasn't just a wasteland, he said. It was something else. It used to be alive. And these formations, they might be remnants of its old ecosystem. Relin remained still, his wings tightening against his back. "Are you suggesting that the bacteria are reactivating a dormant cycle?" Daniel nodded. "More than that. I think the planet was in a state of stasis, like a deep freeze. The bacteria weren't just waiting for the right conditions. They were waiting for something to trigger a reset." Before Relin could respond, a low rumble vibrated through the ground beneath them. Daniel braced himself, eyes widening as cracks formed along the crater's edge. A moment later, a thin mist seeped upward from the fissures, curling like spectral tendrils into the cooling air. Relin stepped back, his talons gripping the loose soil. "That's water vapor." Daniel barely heard him. His mind raced, connecting the data. The bacteria had caused a small but measurable increase in temperature, which in turn had destabilized the mineral deposits underground. Those minerals, locked away for millennia, contained traces of moisture, frozen remnants of a past climate. With the rising heat, that moisture was being released. He pressed his fingers into the dirt. It was damp. "We've started something we can't stop," he muttered. Relin's wings flared slightly, his posture shifting. "If this continues, the planet's climate will undergo rapid transformation." Daniel exhaled sharply. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. This was a planetary-scale event unfolding before his eyes. He had assumed the process would take months, years even, but the reality was different. The bacteria had accelerated everything. The ecosystem wasn't just reviving, it was fighting to return in full force. A sharp chirp sounded from Relin's scanner. He glanced at the display, his feathers ruffling. "Temperature variance is increasing. Humidity is rising," he looked up. "This planet is waking up." Daniel knew what that meant. If the process continued, the conditions on X-47b would become unstable. A controlled terraforming experiment had turned into an uncontrolled resurgence. He stood abruptly, grabbing his communicator. "We need to report this to Professor Jules Vache," he said. Roland hesitated for half a second before nodding. Daniel activated the device, sending a direct signal to the professor's observation station. It took only moments for the response to come through, but in that short span of time, the ground trembled again. The mist thickened, swirling around his legs. He swore under his breath. The communicator crackled, then the professor's voice came through, sharp and precise. "Explain." Daniel took a steadying breath. "We have a situation," he said. "I discovered dormant microbial life beneath the surface. It's been reactivated, and it's triggering environmental changes at an accelerated rate." A pause, then, "Define accelerated." Daniel glanced at Relin, who tapped a command into his scanner, sending the data directly to the professor. Within seconds, the response came, this time with an edge of urgency. "Return to base, immediately." Daniel was already moving before the words fully registered. Relin followed, his wings spreading slightly for balance as they navigated the uneven terrain. The wind was shifting, carrying a deeper, richer scent, something that reminded Daniel of approaching rain. By the time they reached the encampment, the other students had already noticed the change in the air. The Uruk were sniffing the breeze, their thick reptilian hides twitching. The Lenari clustered together, their translucent skin pulsing with faint bioluminescent patterns. In evolutionary response to environmental shifts, Professor Jules Vache stood near the central station, his towering insectoid form rigid with focus. His compound eyes flickered as he scanned the data. He did not speak immediately, but Daniel could see the gears turning in his mind. Finally, the professor exhaled, the sound resembling the clicking of shifting plates. "You have disturbed something ancient," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "This planet was not meant to be reawakened so quickly." Daniel swallowed, the weight of his actions settling heavily on his chest. "Can it be controlled?" The professor regarded him for a long moment. "That remains to be seen." A crack of thunder rolled across the sky. Daniel looked up. The clouds had thickened, their edges tinged with blue. He felt a single drop of moisture hit his cheek. It was beginning to rain. Daniel stood motionless as the first drops of rain splattered against the cracked earth. The sensation was almost surreal. X-47b had been declared a dead world, a place where moisture hadn't touched the ground for centuries, yet here it was, real, tangible rain. He wiped a damp streak from his cheek, feeling the coolness of it against his skin. Around him, the other students had gone silent, their gazes fixed on the darkening sky. The clouds churned, thickening into ominous masses that crackled with electric energy. A second rumble of thunder rolled through the sky, deeper this time, more resonant. Daniel turned his attention to Professor Jules Vache, who remained rigid, his many eyes scanning the environment with unnerving precision. The professor's mandibles clicked together, his expression unreadable, though the tension in his stance betrayed his concern. "This development was not part of the parameters," Jules Vache said, his voice like distant grinding stone. "The planet is destabilizing." Daniel clenched his jaw. "It's not destabilizing," he countered. "It's reacting. This isn't destruction, it's restoration." The professor's head tilted slightly, his gaze settling on Daniel with piercing intensity. "You presume too much." Before Daniel could respond, Relin moved to his side, his golden eyes reflecting the storm's growing intensity. The Avexi had remained quiet since their return to camp, but now his posture was tense, his feathers twitching. "The readings confirm it," Relin said. "The oxygen levels are still rising. Humidity has increased by 11% in the last hour alone. This process is accelerating far beyond any natural restoration cycle." Jules Vache shifted his attention to the data feed streaming from the observation station. He studied it for a long moment before finally exhaling. "Then the question remains. Will this cycle stabilize, or will it consume itself?" Daniel looked toward the ridge where it had all started. The mist had thickened, swirling in ghostly tendrils across the ground, merging with the raindrops to form thin streams of water that cut through the dust like veins through flesh. The bacteria had done more than survive. They had catalyzed an ecological awakening. Another bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the shifting clouds with eerie brilliance. A gust of wind tore through the camp, sending loose equipment tumbling across the rocky ground. Daniel shielded his face, his heart hammering. The transformation was happening too quickly. A warning beep from one of the monitors made Jules Vache snap his attention back to the data. His posture stiffened. "Temperature variance has shifted unpredictably," he announced. "We are reaching a threshold we do not understand." Daniel's stomach twisted. He had known the risks of tampering with a dormant system, but he had never imagined the change would unfold on such a massive scale. He needed more time. Time to study the bacterial activity, to measure the long-term effects, to ensure that this wasn't just a temporary storm, but a true rebirth. But time was slipping away. Professor Jules Vache activated the emergency channel, his voice cutting through the crackling airwaves with sharp precision. "Mission Control, this is Overseer Jules Vache. We have a developing anomaly on X-47b, requesting immediate planetary analysis and risk assessment. Repeat, immediate assessment required." The communicator crackled before stabilizing. A new voice, cold and efficient, responded. "Acknowledged, Overseer. We are receiving your data now. Stand by." Daniel turned to Relin. "If this is a full-scale environmental reset, then we need to know what comes next. The bacterial cycle is just the beginning. There could be deeper systems reactivating." Relin nodded. "I'll recalibrate the scanners to detect deeper geological shifts." The Avexi moved quickly, adjusting the sensors while Daniel scanned the horizon. The ground had darkened where the rain had begun to soak into the once arid soil. If the water continued to accumulate, new biological processes would begin. Organisms long buried beneath the surface could awaken. He had intended to revive bacteria, but what if something more complex had been trapped in stasis, waiting for the right moment to return? His thoughts were interrupted as the emergency channel flared to life again. "Overseer Jules Vache, this is Mission Control. We have completed a preliminary analysis. Your location is experiencing an active biospheric event. Atmospheric shifts are consistent with a Class E terraformation anomaly. We advise immediate evacuation." Daniel's breath caught. Class 5 terraformation anomaly. That meant rapid, uncontrollable ecological change. A planet shifting too quickly for stable habitation. Jules Vache remained unmoving, his multi-lensed eyes scanning the sky as if deciphering a silent message. Finally, he turned toward the students. "Pack your equipment," he ordered. "We leave within the hour." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. "No," he said before he could stop himself. "We can't leave yet." Jules Vache's gaze snapped toward him. "You misunderstand the gravity of this situation, human. We do not have the luxury of waiting to see how this unfolds." Daniel stepped forward. "You don't get it. This isn't a catastrophe. This is an opportunity. We're watching a planet wake up after centuries of dormancy. If we leave now, we might never know what happens next." Jules Vache's mandibles tightened. "It is not our place to interfere beyond acceptable scientific limits. We do not dictate the fate of planets. We observe." Daniel felt frustration claw at his chest. "Then observe. But don't shut this down before we understand it." Relin spoke up, his voice steady. "Daniel is right. If this event is happening, it must be recorded in full. We should leave an automated station to continue monitoring the progression." Jules Vache considered this, his mind calculating the risks. "A monitoring station will take time to deploy," he said. Daniel nodded. "Then we don't waste a second." The team worked quickly, assembling a temporary observation post with extended-range sensors and data transmitters. As they secured the last component, the rain intensified. The ground, once dry and lifeless, had begun absorbing the moisture, darkening into fertile soil. Thin wisps of steam rose where dormant minerals reacted to the new atmosphere. As the transport shuttle prepared for departure, Daniel took one last look at the crater where it had all started. The mist was still there, swirling, alive. He knew, deep in his bones, that this planet was not the same place he had landed on. It was something new, something reborn. As the engines roared to life, lifting the shuttle from the surface, he made a silent vow. One day he would return, and when he did, this world would no longer